public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Drugs are menacing our society.
So let me just get your position on this, though. You think the federal government should just stay out of trying to legalize all drugs, and that's not just marijuana, but all drugs?
Right, and I would let the states deal with it. It would be a state issue on how they do it. I recall as a youngster when I worked in a drugstore, I sold codeine and cough medicine over the counter. I could buy it as a teenager. And it wasn't a drug problem, so it isn't the lack of laws that causes the drug problem. I mean, the real drug problem and disaster in this country is alcohol and nicotine. That's what's killing people. So we're dealing with the minutia, but we're creating a monstrous legal problem costing hundreds of billions of dollars and putting people in prison that should be treated as sick people. They shouldn't be treated as criminals. We treat alcoholics. What if we put all our alcoholics in prison? I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. Prohibition of alcohol was the biggest absurdity, social absurdity, and it committed a lot of crime. Back then, it was the borders between the United States and Canada. That's where the alcohol was coming in, from Canada back there in Prohibition. Now it's Mexico. But the problems we have is because the price of these drugs is about 1,000 times greater than it would be. Actually, some of this stuff is useless if it's just allowed to be out in the open. So we've created most of the problems for ourselves, and these drug wars are a consequence of our policy.
The cost of the war on drugs. Does it make sense to decriminalize drugs? Decriminalization of drugs would reduce state and federal deficits by eliminating expenditures on prohibition enforcement, including arrests, prosecutions, and incarcerations. At an approximate cost of $22,000 per prisoner, in 2009, the federal government spent $2,094,510,000 housing drug-related prisoners. Of the 14,209,365 total arrests in the United States in 2007, 13% were as a result of drug prohibition. That's like putting almost everyone in Hawaii and Alaska in prison. If drugs were decriminalized, the government would save $25.7 billion in state and local expenses and $15.6 billion in federal government expenses annually. How is the federal tax money spent on the war on drugs? In 2008, federal expenses reached $15.6 billion. $3.4 billion was used to fight marijuana. $7.1 billion was used to fight cocaine. $1.24 billion was used to fight heroin. $3.9 billion was used to fight other drugs. Every 19 seconds, someone in the U.S. is arrested for a drug violation. 82% of these arrests are for possession alone. The total number of federal inmates convicted in 2009 was 187,886,000. Of that, 95,205 were convicted for drug-related charges. About 51% of federal inmates are a direct result of a drug conviction. 47% of Americans over 12 admitted to using illegal drugs.
We've turned the corner on drug addiction in the United States. Drug addiction in the United States is under control.
After 40 years fighting the war on drugs, it's easier to buy marijuana than it is to buy a beer, according to a national survey of teenagers. Our legal system is completely overburdened. Nearly 4 out of 10 murders, 6 out of 10 rapes, and 9 out of 10 burglaries go unsolved, according to the Department of Justice. Over 35,000 people have been killed in just 4 years due to the violence related to Mexico's fight with their massive Mexican drug cartels. Violence, which is now making its way across the border into the U.S. Pat Buchanan of MSNBC once said, "How does one win a drug war when millions of Americans who use recreational drugs are financing the cartels bribing, murdering, and beheading to win the war and keep self-indulgent Americans supplied with drugs? There are 2 sure ways to end this war swiftly: Milton's way and Mao's way. Mao Zedong's communists killed users and suppliers alike as social parasites. Milton Friedman's way is to decriminalize drugs and call off the war. Americans are never going to adopt the Maoist solution, for the users of drugs are all too often classmates, colleagues, friends, even family. Indeed, our last 3 presidents did not deny using drugs."
I mean, look, the markets in marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine are global commodities markets, just like the global markets in alcohol, tobacco, coffee, sugar, and so many other things. Where there is a demand, there will be a supply. Knock out one source and another inevitably emerges. People tend to think of prohibition as the ultimate form of regulation, when in fact it represents the abdication of regulation, with criminals filling the void. Which is why putting criminal laws and police front and center in trying to control a dynamic global commodities market is a recipe for disaster. And what we really need to do is to bring the underground drug markets as much as possible above ground and regulate them as intelligently as we can to minimize both the harms of drugs and the harms of prohibitionist policies.